Am I audible? Okay, awesome. Thanks for the intro. Just for a quick show of hands, how many of you know the similarities between RMS Titanic and the German encryption machine called Enigma? Anyone? What is it that is common between these two systems? Okay. One was thought to be unsinkable, and the other one was thought to be unbreakable. But unfortunately, both these massive systems, one synced very drastically, and the other one was broken by the British, and that kind of decided the direction of the World War as well. Another commonality between these two majorly popular strong systems was that they did not take the disaster recovery aspect of it very seriously, which means that they did not plan for it properly. And you might have seen in the movies, when Titanic was sinking, they only had access to less than 20 odd lifeboats, which actually complicated their recovery mechanisms. With that intro, probably we'll get started with this topic of today, Zero Trust Backup Security. And we're going to be talking about a newly launched capability called multi-party approval within AWS Backup. But we'll try to stitch together some of the use cases around what customers should be looking for around it. What we're going to cover today is the driving factor at somebody wanting to look at disaster recovery, very specifically in this era, and the foundations for a reliable recovery, and probably a high-level introduction to AWS Backup, which Sachin covered briefly before my talk, and the multi-party approval, which is the center of today's talk. And some of the important recovery concepts and a reference architecture on how you can put together these things. So everyone might have talked about what is a ransomware attack, why you should be concerned about a ransomware attack and all these things, and what really causes a ransomware attack. And there is always different ways in which an enterprise can get compromised. This could be through the presence of a malware or a compromising software, or it could be through the identity route, which could be through leaked credentials or like your IDP itself getting compromised. But we have talked enough about these things. What our customers are interested these days is about the actual impact of the ransomware event after the compromise has happened. So once the ransomware incident generally happens, there is always a after effect of a ransomware incident where the compromiser would want to go behind your backup options or your recovery options so that they have a higher chance of getting a ransom paid out. And if the attacker is actually spending 3 to 6 months trying to compromise a larger enterprise, and if the enterprise have got access to a latest backup, obviously they would be using the backups to recover rather than trying to pay the ransom. So whenever a ransomware attack happens, generally the after effect of that incident would be the backups getting compromised. Once the ransomware event happens, or the incident in which your critical data is being encrypted, the most important aspect for any enterprise is to ensure that they stress on the post-event recovery. But between the post-event recovery and the actual ransomware incident, there is always a data loss, which is what the customers would want to minimize. So ensuring that you recover your organizations as soon as possible is the effective metric for you to ensure that your business can get back to normal. So let's try to look at the foundation for what a reliable recovery would look like. At the core of everything is the last mile defense, which we have been talking about in the form of backup. So backup is your opportunity to ensure that there is an amount of data that you can build from to recover your enterprise. But just by having backups will not solve for the recovery resilience problem. Think about backup as your foundational layer, and there is a three-legged stool that you would want to build on top of this particular foundation. Obviously, all of these components that we're going to talk about today is very critical in your recovery resilience. The first important aspect of ensuring your backups are recoverable is to ensure that your backups are immutable and isolated, which is part of the 3-2-1-1 strategy that we've kind of talked about previously. So if your backups are immutable, which means that they cannot be modified, and if they are isolated from your production data, it ensures that you have got access to a proper backup. And the next important leg of your three-leg stool is the integrity of the data. So if your backup is never validated or it was never checked for integrity, and in the event of requiring this backup to be accessed for ensuring your recovery, and if this data was not integral in nature, this backup is as good as not existing. And the third important pillar of your three-legged stool is the availability aspect of it. So you might have an immutable backup, integral in nature, but what if this backup was never accessible? What if your identity route to your backup was compromised and you can't access those things? So, like I was mentioning earlier, the most important way in which you can build your recovery is by relying on the proper foundation of having effective backups and these three legs of the stool, which is immutability, isolation, integrity, and availability. And that's what your recovery has to be built on top of. So let's look into the first pillar of it, which is the immutability and isolation of backup. So like Sachin was introducing, AWS Backup was launched 6 years back as a simple scheduling tool that was meant to take off most of the undifferentiated heavy lifting from our customers. So using this service, you would be able to work backwards from your data protection strategies by defining simple attributes part of your backup program, which is what resources need to be backed up, how often they should be backed up, how many copies have to be kept of, and how long these backup have to be kept. By defining these strategies, AWS Backup as a service will be able to take off most of the undifferentiated heavy lifting from you and then perform these actions for you without the hassle of any licensing cost and all those things. But that's not just it. AWS Backup also has got many other components, including Backup Audit Manager and restore testing that was discussed previously, which allows you to ensure you can implement a proper organization-wide backup strategy. The other important aspect of AWS Backup is a concept called Backup Vault. So much like how you would already know that Amazon S3 bucket by itself is not a storage container. It is just a logical container that allows you to group all of your objects. What gets stored is the object and what gets charged is the actual object itself. But the bucket allows you to define strategies at a combination or at a collection level. So if you've got a collection of objects that can be grouped together and put inside a bucket, you would be able to define access patterns and strategies at the bucket level. So this could be how the encryption happens, how the lifecycle happens, who can access the data and all those things. Likewise, AWS Backup have a concept called a Backup Vault. So you can group all of your recovery points based on the data classification or the sensitivity of the data and all those things and apply data access strategies on top of it. So 2 years back, AWS Backup launched a new type of vault called the AWS Backup Logically Air-Gap Vault. So the AWS Backup Logically Air-Gap Vault is a service-managed backup vault in which the management of your vault is kind of offloaded to AWS Backup as a service. So what does this bring to the table? One is that previously the immutability configuration of the backup vault was a choice given to the customers, but now with the AWS Backup Logically Air-Gap Vault, the vault is immutable by nature, which means that any backup that you store in this AWS Backup Logically Air-Gap Vault is immutable in nature, which means that until the expiry of the recovery points, nobody can delete it, even the root user of your account. And the other important aspect is that any recovery point that is stored in this AWS Backup Logically Air-Gap Vault is encrypted using a service-owned key. So you might already be aware of a customer managed key, an AWS managed key. The third category of the keys called the service-owned keys is what is used to encrypt your recovery points. So which means that the threat vector of the KMS keys getting compromised does not apply to this particular vault. But that's not all of it. The other important capability of Logically Air-Gap Vault is that it seamlessly integrates with AWS Resource Access Manager, or RAM in short, which means that you can now share the contents of this Logically Air-Gap Vault with any other account of a choice within your organization or even outside of your organization, which means that you can now have a faster restore experience. Okay, so that was the first pillar, which is the immutability aspect and isolation of it. So imagine a scenario where you're doing a daily backup and keeping it for 14 days. So these numbers from 1 to 7 are your daily backups for the first 7 days. And the color green indicates that, okay, these backups are free from any malware or compromises, which means that these are clean backups. And this is generally the safe period of your recovery, which means that if there is any compromise during this period, you can safely use these backups to recover your data. But imagine after some time, like let's say on the 7th day, there was a malware that somehow tripped your EDR or XDR systems and made it your primary data, like your EBS volume. Obviously, the backup that is made out of that particular EBS volume will also have the copy of the malware. And this is what we call generally the scenarios in which if you're able to pinpoint the actual malware in your data, you would be able to surgically remove this data. So, for example, if there is a virus.exe, obviously nobody would name the file as virus.exe if they were to compromise your systems. And if you can safely detonate your backups into an isolated environment and remove only the virus.exe, you will be able to extract all of the other data so that you can keep your RPO still intact, which is what we call the surgically fixable recovery period. But obviously, the effect of malware is eventually to have a compromise done on your data. So the presence of malware is still an okay situation, where it has not yet compromised any of your data. But if the malware eventually gets access to a computer environment and it can start encrypting your data, what would happen is that any backup data that is created from your protection systems will now have the encrypted data as well. So which means that the colors red indicate they are compromised data, and which is what we call the depleted recovery options period, wherein if you have to recover during days between 11 to 14, your obvious choice is to either go back to 8, 9, 10 or days from 1 to 7. But that's not it. Sorry. If you were to not detect the presence of malware or ransomware in your data, which is the most unavoidable situation you should be in, after day 21, what now happens is that all of your good known backups, which is green in color, are now deleted, which means that you're left with the yellow color backup or the red ones, which means that if there is a recovery required, you're stuck with data that is already compromised. So that is why there is an importance of ensuring the integrity of your data when you're planning for backups. Okay, so now the important topic of today's talk here. AWS AWS organization launched a new capability called multi-party approval during Reinforce 2025. So the thought process behind multi-party approval is that in the event of wanting to do any kind of privileged operations in your organization, we would require multi-factor authenticated users to be approving an operation. So imagine you have a quorum of approved users within your organization, like for example your CEO or CFO being part of a quorum of users, and before an operation could be approved, what we are saying is that at least a minimum number of users within a set of users have to approve an operation. Why do we do this one? This is to ensure that in the event of an identity compromise in your organization, a single user compromise cannot compromise an approval process within an organization. So if there is a compromise happening, by ensuring that the compromiser can compromise at least the minimum number of users is what will break this particular system. So multi-party approval is a capability part of the AWS organizations and the accounts feature, but AWS Backup is the first consumer of it. And how does it work together? So imagine in your entire AWS setup, you have got a primary AWS organization in which you have set up a logically air gap vault, in which you have got all of your crown jewel data's backup kept there. Because you are concerned about the identity route compromise in the primary organization, what we are saying is that you should have prepared for this scenario, the eventual scenario of your primary IDP being compromised. You'd be setting up a recovery organization in your organization by connecting to a backup IDP. So in this diagram, your AWS organization primary will be using an IDP1, and your AWS organization recovery will be using an IDP2. And the first thing that you would have to do is to create what we call a multi-party approval team. So, and within the multi-party approval team, you will be adding a couple of users and defining what is the minimum required number of approvals. And obviously this particular multi-party approval team have to be assigned to the primary AWS account so that the backup admin in the logically air gap vault can connect that multi-party approval team to the logic layer gap vault. So the reason why we do is that just by assigning a multi-party approval team to the account does not allow you to take over anything. You would require a collaboration between the primary account owner and the multi-party approval team to ensure that there is a trust being built up. So in the event of a compromise scenario that you can't access your primary AWS account, what we are saying is that you can set up a new AWS recovery account, which is entirely clean with all of your security controls being intact. And you can now assign this multi-party approval team, which is still accessible through your recovery organization, to the recovery account. And what will now happen is that from the recovery account, you can raise a request to get access to the logic layer gap vault in the primary account. So this is in a scenario that your primary account cannot be logged into, but you still be able to raise a request to get access to this particular logic layer gap vault. And once this approval has been done by the multi-party approval team, AWS Backup will not magically, through the functionality, provide you with what we call a restore access backup vault. So all of the data that was previously in a logic layer gap vault, in an account which was not accessible through an identity route which is compromised, what we are saying is that you will now be able to access the references of all those backups in your recovery account, which is clean and entirely set up using the security principles. And you can now able to do restores in this account. You can also do copy operations from this particular restore access vault. This is a scenario generally where you're concerned about your primary AWS account not being, organization not being accessible, which is including your root account compromise or your management account compromise. But the same setup can be applied to your primary account compromise as well, but assuming that you can still access the organization. So the same set of operations that we saw in the recovery could be applied in the scenario as well. So with the multi-party approval team, approval approach, what we are saying is that anything that is protected using a AWS backup logic layer gap vault will now be able to be accessible in a new clean account of your choice, provided you have set up your recovery organizations properly. So let's probably look into some of the important recovery concepts, because until now, when we talked about backup vaults, we were always talking about individual components, like your EBS volumes, RDS instances, and all those things. So most of the time, whenever you think about recovery, like it was mentioned in the morning during the Commvault session, the most important aspect to your recovery is to ensure that you define what we call the minimum viable company. So whenever you try to recover an organization, you should have already defined what we call the minimum viable company and the crown jewel applications and the critical path of recovery that will define what is a phase through which all of your organization could be recovered to the minimum viable situation. And that probably completes the phase one of the recovery, which allows your organization to probably get back to its feet. And this is what we call the critical path of recovery, which ensures that you've got a proper foundation from which you can start recovering your organization. So without the proper planning and execution of a minimum viable company and the critical path of recovery, I've not seen any organization being able to recover properly. Okay, so let's look at how this all plugs in together with our reference architecture. I know we are almost at time. So what we are recommending is that, like Sachin was introducing, AWS Backup allows you to backup not only the resources within an AWS account, but also anything in your on-premises data center through the backup gateway services. So any components that you currently back up to a backup vault can be copied into a logic layer gap vault for further isolation and immutability. And with the integration of forensic analysis and the resource access manager sharing in AWS Backup Logic Layer Gap Vault, you will be able to integrate with partner solutions like the one from Elastio.com, which allows you to perform not just malware, but also ransomware scanning on your data. So there is always a big difference between what you do with a proper malware scanning solution and a ransomware scanning solution. A malware scanning solution generally looks for pattern-based matching or a Bitdefender-based, database-based scanning, which looks for patterns in your data. But the ransomware scanning solution generally looks for an impact of the data. So if you were to scan a backup for a malware, that might be too late for you to have detected the presence of malware. what you should ideally be concerned is the presence of the malware, which is the actual encryption impact of your data. So if your data is already encrypted, that is a trigger for you to say that, okay, I need to now go back in time and then probably find my last good node backup and try to recover from it. And if you want to recover, like how MPA was introduced, you will now be able to create a share through the multi-party approval scenario and then have it recovered. And now you can recover not just to your primary AWS organization, but to any other organization of your choice. So one important thing to note here is that you can see none of these accounts are part of a single organization. So we do have larger customers who kind of operate the forensic account in a separate security organization, and you would be able to recover in a separate recovery organization and all those things. So this is completely flexible and up to your appetite. And just to summarize what we discussed until now, obviously, recovery resilience is not an IT problem. IT is facilitating it, but it has to be a business concern, and a lot of investments has to come from the business itself. And like I was highlighting earlier, these days, part of any ransomware attack, backups are also becoming a target, and you would have seen that in some of the high-profile attacks happening in India as well. And you can't combine operational recovery and cyber recovery as in the same boat. So what you have as an RTO and RPO should not be mixed up as your cyber RTO and RPO, which has to be dealt with separately with concepts like clean room recovery and all those things. And obviously, cyber resilience is a business problem as well. And that's pretty much what I had to cover back in a 20-minute session. Happy to be taking any questions post the event, and thank you very much.